Last year, a 72-year-old man in Arizona was pulled over for something almost laughably small, a cracked taillight. No criminal record, no history, nothing suspicious, just a routine stop. 9 minutes later, he was sitting in the back of a patrol car. Not because he broke a serious law, not because there was anything illegal in his vehicle, but because of a few words. Words he thought were harmless, words most people say without thinking. And here's the part that unsettles even experienced drivers. In many cases, it's not what you do during a traffic stop that creates risk. It's what you say. Have you ever wondered, if you were pulled over today, would your own words protect you or quietly work against you? Tell me honestly in the comments. Would you stay calm, or do you think you might accidentally say something that could make things worse? Because what we're about to uncover isn't obvious, and for seniors especially, the stakes are higher than most people realize. And here's why. Under U.S. law, traffic stops are considered a type of temporary detention. Courts have generally held that officers can ask certain questions, observe behavior, and make decisions based on both facts and what they perceive. And that perception can change instantly based on a single sentence. But here's what most people don't realize. As we age, we tend to communicate differently, more politely, more openly, sometimes more nervously. And while that comes from a good place, in a legal setting, it can be misunderstood. And this is where things take a turn. Because in 2026, enforcement patterns have shifted in subtle ways. Not necessarily new laws everywhere, but evolving interpretations, training updates, and increased emphasis on officer discretion. Which means the margin for misunderstanding is thinner than ever. And what happens next has surprised even experienced legal analysts. Let's start with something that sounds completely innocent. I didn't realize I was doing anything wrong. Now think about that for a second. It feels honest. It feels reasonable. It feels like you're simply explaining yourself. But under U.S. law, statements like this can sometimes be interpreted as a form of admission. Not an admission of guilt in a courtroom sense, but an acknowledgement tied to the situation. Courts have generally held that voluntary statements made during a stop can be considered in evaluating probable cause or reasonable suspicion. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable, because even if your intention is to clarify, the wording can shift how the officer perceives the situation. And perception often drives what happens next. But here's what most people don't realize. You are not required to explain everything immediately. In many cases, providing identification and basic required documents is sufficient, unless further questions are legally justified. And yet, many seniors, out of respect or habit, begin explaining, elaborating, filling silence, and silence feels uncomfortable. But sometimes, silence is actually protection, and this is where things take a turn most people never see coming, because the second phrase is even more common. I'm sorry. Now pause. That doesn't sound dangerous at all, right? It sounds polite, responsible, even respectful. But under legal interpretation, apologies can sometimes be perceived as acknowledgement of fault. Not always, not automatically, but in many cases, context matters. Courts have generally held that statements made voluntarily during interactions can be considered alongside other evidence. So when someone says, "I'm sorry," it can be interpreted in multiple ways. Was it just politeness, or was it acknowledgement? And here's the problem. You don't get to control how it's interpreted in that moment. And this is where things become psychologically complex. Because seniors, especially those raised in more formal or respectful communication cultures, are far more likely to use apologetic language. It's instinct. But in a legal environment, instinct can create unintended consequences. And what happens next is where most people make the biggest mistake. They start talking more, trying to clarify, trying to fix what they just said. And every additional word creates more room for interpretation. But here's what most people don't realize. Under the Fifth Amendment, individuals have the right to remain silent beyond basic identification requirements in many situations. This doesn't mean being uncooperative, it means being careful. And that distinction is critical, because the third phrase is where situations escalate quickly. I only had one drink. Now think about how often people say something like this. It sounds minimal. It sounds harmless. It sounds like you're being transparent. But under DUI enforcement practices, statements like this can significantly influence how an officer proceeds. In many cases, even minimal admissions can contribute to reasonable suspicion, and once that threshold is crossed, the situation changes. Field sobriety tests, further questioning, extended detention. And this is where things take a turn most drivers never anticipate. Because what started as a simple traffic stop can evolve into something far more serious based on a single sentence. But here's what most people don't realize. You are not legally required to volunteer information beyond what is necessary. And volunteering is often where risk enters. Not because you're guilty, but because you're human. And humans talk, especially under pressure. And pressure changes behavior. Now here's where it gets even more surprising. The fourth phrase, go ahead and search. On the surface, this sounds cooperative, respectful, even helpful. But under U.S. law, consent searches are one of the most significant areas where individuals give up rights without realizing it. Courts have consistently held that if consent is given voluntarily, a search can proceed without a warrant or probable cause. And here's the critical part. Once consent is given, it becomes very difficult to challenge that search later, even if nothing is found, even if the situation feels uncomfortable afterward. And this is where things become deeply misunderstood. Because many seniors, wanting to avoid conflict, will say yes immediately, not realizing that they had a choice, not realizing that they could respectfully decline. And this isn't about hiding anything, it's about understanding your rights. And this is where the psychological tension builds, because saying no feels confrontational, but legally, it's not. It's simply exercising a right. And here's what most people don't realize. Officers are trained to observe not just what you say, but how you say it. Tone, body language, eye movement. And for seniors, natural signs of aging, like slower responses or nervousness, can sometimes be misinterpreted. And that misinterpretation can influence decisions. Now, what happens next is something almost no one talks about. The fifth phrase, why are you stopping me? Again, sounds reasonable. You're asking a question. But in certain situations, depending on tone and context, it can be perceived as confrontational. And perception matters. Courts have generally allowed officers to control the flow of a stop for safety reasons. So while you have the right to understand why you were stopped, how and when you ask can influence the tone of the interaction. And this is where things take a turn that surprises most people. Because it's not just about the words themselves, it's about timing, delivery, and emotional state. And this is where seniors face a unique challenge. Because reaction time, stress response, and communication style can all shift under pressure. And pressure is exactly what a traffic stop creates. But here's what most people don't realize. The safest approach is often the simplest. Provide required documents, stay calm, avoid volunteering unnecessary information, and if unsure, pause before speaking. That pause can change everything. Now think about this for a moment. How many times have you seen someone talk themselves into trouble without realizing it? Not because they were guilty, but because they were trying to explain, trying to be helpful, trying to resolve the situation quickly. And in doing so, they created more complexity. And this is where the deeper truth emerges. Traffic stops are not conversations. They are legal interactions. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because the goal is not to win an argument, not to prove innocence on the spot, but to remain legally protected. And this is where things take one final turn. Because awareness is the difference between control and vulnerability. And for seniors, that awareness becomes even more important because experience can sometimes create overconfidence. I've been driving for 40 years. I know how this works. But enforcement evolves, interpretations evolve, and what worked decades ago may not apply the same way today. And that shift is where risk hides. So the next time you see flashing lights in your mirror, the next time your heart rate rises, the next time you feel that pressure to speak quickly, remember this. It's not about saying more, it's about saying less and saying it carefully. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. If this opened your eyes, even a little, If it made you rethink how you would handle that moment, subscribe, because what you don't know can hurt you. And share this with someone who needs to understand it before they find out the hard way.